Western women, 30 and under, have no child. Half of them will never have a child, and 90% of them will regret it. This is a catastrophe.
Your life will be happier if you have a partner and children. That's just true. And people should be told that, and then they should be told the realities of fertility. But in my case, Jordan, from that day to this, I've always loved working. I love it. It's totally exciting and interesting and intellectually stimulating to me, and I cannot imagine not doing this.
We do potentially have a major societal issue in that men have their pathologies that are expressed socially: aggression, antisocial behavior, drug and alcohol abuse. But there's no reason to assume whatsoever that women wouldn't bring their own pathologies to the workplace.
I've seen women behaving terribly over the past 5 years in particular, and they're at the apex of the bad messaging. They're obsessed with abortion, which I just think speaks to a lot of things, like the absence of religion in the public square. So I just think the whole system is set up to breed that kind of woman. It's
become mandatory in our culture to assume that the feminist movement has elevated women to the status that they now enjoy. I'm not so sure about that. I think that technological transformation and plumbing has had a lot more to do with that than ideological movement, let's say, especially one based on resentment. But in any case, it is the case.
As you can see, the content today we're getting into today will be about the feminist movement and its reactions on society today. Today, we're going to take a deep dive with Jordan Peterson and Morgan. I forget her last name at the moment, but they are going into a heated debate on what the current state of affairs are because of the failing birth rates in modern society. We're going to take a deep dive into everything that's going on and then correlate it with our own lives. Let's jump back into this content. I hope that you guys are having a good one. If you're new here, hit that subscribe button for me. If you've already been here and you're liking this content, hit the like button because it's absolutely free to you and it helps me to grow and it helps immensely. And I thank you every step of the way, guys. All right.
Case that women occupy a position in society that was unheard of 100 years ago. There's a downside to all of that. And the downside appears to be the mounting unhappiness among young women, the precipitous decline in birth rates, the collapse of marriage as a social institution, and a spate of childlessness among young women, as well as the feminization of our institutions in a manner that often borders on the pathological.
So that's a lot of stuff to bite down on. So just so you guys can understand in a very simple terms, he's talking about why we aren't having as many children anymore, why the marriage system is failing, and it was a system established to create happy and long-lasting families, and why we have increasingly moved towards catering towards the feminist movement, but not actually succeeding in their goals, which is crazy to me for a movement that's lasted for so long. It would seem as though you would get some type of gains from whatever you are marching towards. Does it not? I don't know, but let's let the men speak.
Discuss these issues today with Megan Kelly, a woman who's married, who has children, and who's had a stellar career. And we attempted to sort through these thorny issues and come to a conclusion about how men and women might conduct themselves in relationship to one another and what the consequences of that are for the way we think about ourselves and society. You've had a very successful career, and I'm kind of curious about how you've balanced your life and your work and how that's worked for you, and what advice you would give young women who are apparently struggling quite radically. Now, young men have their problems, and there's no doubt about that, but I think it's something in the neighborhood of 50 to 60% of liberal young women in particular between the ages of 18 and 34 who suffer from at least one diagnosable mental disorder, for example. Mm-hmm. And, you know, when polls show pretty consistently that since the 1960s, the average self-reported happiness of young women in particular has declined, and quite precipitously. So let's start with that.
Well, I'm not surprised.
Well, before we get into that, let's look up a random year. So this is from 5 years ago, but just a random scale, right? In the early 70s, women reported themselves to be happier in the 0.20 scale, where life satisfaction has fallen extremely in the 2000s, and they're trying to say it's back on the rise. But let's get some more statistics. Let's get it.
To hear those stats about liberal women in particular, because look, I see it with my own daughter.
Precipitously. So let's start with that.
Well, I'm not surprised to hear those stats about liberal women in particular, because look, I see it with my own daughter who's 14. The schools today try to exploit young girls and young women's empathy to bend them to their democratic norms. They try to impose all of their left-wing viewpoints on these young girls by tapping into the empathy vein. You know, if you don't support Black Lives Matter, you're racist. If you don't support trans girls, meaning boys, playing in girl sports, you're a bigot. They're bullied. Don't be a bully. Be a nice girl. That's how we've been raised for time immemorial, to be nice girls who get
What do you think about that? The emotional manipulation of our young children to be indoctrinated by the social norms of the community. And I think that happens in every generation because there's an agenda being pushed. And a lot of people in the young stages, they go to the schools where a lot of this information is shared, and then it becomes the new norm. So we do have to watch where your children go to school and all these kind of things because it actually matters.
patted on the heads. And you're not a nice girl if you're a bully or a bigot or a racist. So I'm not surprised at all that girls who don't get inoculated against that kind of thinking at home, who go into any normal school system, will be indoctrinated in that kind of thinking, and will wind up very unhappy, because her natural instincts will be to fight against things like watching a boy take all of her blue ribbons. But she's been told by all the people she respects, in the school setting at least, that she's a bad person if she objects to that. And I think that incongruous feeling leads to unhappiness. I think the reward system of K through 12 and college education right now is for people who play the victim. And so much the better if you could actually be a victim. That would be terrific. You will be celebrated. You will be the cool one. You'll get the snaps from your fellow classmates and your professors. Writing your college essay about what a happy childhood you had and your intact family that supported you and loved you along the way will not get you in anywhere. Maybe 3 universities in the United States. But writing about the destitution derby that you have suffered from 0 to 18 can open doors that would otherwise be closed to you.
How do y'all feel about that, America? Do you feel like we have become a victim culture? Do we have to play the underdog role, the sad role, only for people to even try to hear our stories at all? Because I think that that's really what it is, because you'll see it 1,000 times over in podcasts. The people really tune in when somebody has to give a sob story, or it's the time when people will show you what really actually matters.
Especially if you happen to be a white person, a girl or boy. So all of the incentives are set up in a very backward manner. And I think the other problem facing young liberal women is young liberal men who, by and large, are being turned into these, it's derogatorily referred to as soy boys, but I get it. Like, they're taking the masculinity out of our young men and then telling them that's the only way that they're going to be accepted. And especially young liberal men are buying that and walking around in Birkenstocks with their Starbucks, being quick to cry at any emotional wound. And crying's not, that's fine. You can cry as a man, but most women would like somebody who doesn't do it all the time in response to all emotional upset. They prefer the hunter-gatherer types. And so these young women I talk to on college campuses are looking around for a man who will protect her, who will help lead, who is not afraid to enter hand-to-hand combat if necessary, or just rhetorical combat if necessary, and who, while he treats her as an equal, will put his coat over her shoulders if it's a cool night out, will absolutely protect her if somebody messes with her on the street, will, like my husband does with me, gently move me to the side that's not facing the traffic along the road. Just those small little things that a man does for a woman, and women have a different list that they do for their men if they're in a kind of loving relationship.
Now, hold on, because that just upset me. Did you guys just hear that long list of things that she said that men are supposed to do for a woman if they're married? All these sweet and kind things. And then the moment she was done with that, all she could say was, and there's a list of things that a woman would do for their man, but why didn't you list those things out? This is the problem today, where we say that the older women do not help their younger peers, because instead of giving them the list that they need to be prepared to bring to the table, you just told them everything that they need to be looking for in a man and nothing that they need to be doing to get and keep the man that they want. That is the biggest issue that we have in today's society, and you are not helping to make it better.
And instead, what they're getting is somebody who wants to braid each other's hair, which would depress you and make you question the whole experience.
Yeah, well, it's not surprising, I suppose, that boys are turning in that direction. You know, I met a young man in a restaurant a while back. He wasn't looking too bad when he approached me. He was a waiter, and he said that he had started listening to first Ben Shapiro and then me 6 years ago, something like that, and that prior to that, it was his proclivity and his friends to compete with one another with regard to their victim status, let's say, and to present themselves as radically feminized to the young women that, in principle, they were with. He said that was necessary with the girl he had dated at one point because she was very
Now, this one's question is directly for you guys. Do you guys feel like you had to play the victim to get girls? I have never felt like that. I will say this, that of course, one time during a breakup, there were several women that wanted to come approach me. And then once they heard that I had just lost the relationship, they were more inclined to be, talkative. But I ain't, come out to be looking for nobody just because I broke up and to be saying that sob story. And to be honest with you, that was like a one and done situation. I wasn't going out, that's not a frequent thing because that's not their business. You know what I mean? But everybody has their past, but I don't think that I've ever particularly went out and gave sad sob stories to look for chicks. That's crazy work. If you have had to do that, please let me know down in those comments. This is not a judgment space, but we want to get you to a place where you never have to do that again, and you can do so happily when you speak with women.
Radically liberal, and that was a job requirement, you might say. And he shook all that off and told me and my wife, who was sitting with me, that he was much happier for it. But it doesn't really surprise me, Megan, because boys are not well served in the education system at all, right?
Facts.
Their play preferences. I was just reviewing some stats on ADHD over medication among young boys with one of my producers. And what the original hypothesis, such as it was with regards to hypothetically hyperactive boys, was that stimulants, which is what Ritalin is, have a paradoxical effect on hyperactive young boys, calming them down.
Listen to
And
this.
that's complete bloody biochemical nonsense, and it's a lie psychologically. What stimulants do is focus people intently on whatever they happen to be focused on. And they have exactly the same effect on ordinary boys as they do on hyperactive boys, not least because 90% or 95% of hyperactive boys are actually normal. Stimulants suppress play behavior in animals. So if you give stimulants to young juvenile rats, for example, who are very playful, then they stop playing. And that's exactly why they're administered to young boys in schools. And so their play proclivity is punished quite severely. Any attempt they make to be competitive in a world of cooperative games, and there's really no such thing as a cooperative game, although all games that are ruled.
So I'm sorry, I just wanted to stop because that's very important what he's saying. And you have to be very careful what you're allowing into your children's systems, because not only did he say that it kills the fun part of the brain, so it doesn't allow your child to experience fun anymore in the same way. It just, all it allows them to do is to be hyper focused on a singular task, which, you know, you get things done, but it's only gearing your child to be left brain, to be focused on work and to make them and produce a better worker. It does not help them to develop their hippocampus, which is the other side of the brain, where creativity and other parts of like critical thinking, all of those things kind of happen in your brain. So when you give them these stimulant drugs, they are inhibiting, meaning blocking their ability to do things that they might have been destined to do. Because you don't know if you just had the child that was supposed to be the next Picasso, but because you gave them Ritalin and all of this other stuff for so long, they no longer are able to think on the level that they would have to produce the level of art that they would have made in the first place. And like, you know, you see he has several beautiful pieces of art. You just never know. So you have to be extremely careful, because it's only to produce these results that you're not even thinking about in the long run.
Governed or cooperative. Any sign of ambition they have is pilloried. They're associated constantly with the destructive patriarchy and presented to the world as enemies of the planet. And so it's not surprising that they tilt in a, let's say, feminized direction, especially to appease the angrier women. And there's a deeper problem here that I'd like your thoughts on. You know, the most woke disciplines in the universities, and that's really saying something, are the female-dominated. The more female-dominated
Yes.
they are, there's another contributing factor, right? So the less cognitive power the discipline requires, the more woke it tends to be. So
Yes.
physics is about the least woke discipline, whereas social work, well, you know, the less said about social work, the better. But so we have an issue here too, because I have a suspicion, you tell me what you think about this, because I'm very curious, that the default female ethos, let's say, is nurture. This isn't really a radical idea, I don't think, is nurturer to infant. And in the absence of managerial training, let's say, or rigorous mentoring in the operation of large-scale organizations, every situation turns into an infantilized family. I mean, and it's become absolutely preposterous.
So let's take a second, and because he's jumped over, but what do you think about it for the young men? If we're villainized from the time that we are young, saying that there's toxic masculinity, and I'm going to debunk that right this second. There is no toxic masculinity. There are people who are toxic and cause things to be in a negative light. There is no toxic masculinity. That just happen to be masculine people who are toxic. So I want to hear what you guys think about how we negatively affect our young men by perpetuating, the patriarchy and men aren't ish, men are the problem. So what am I supposed to do? Stop being a man? Because that's exactly what you're saying. Instead of saying men are the problem, say this exactly is the problem. And it happens through this type of people. But we're so broad in our strokes that you don't understand the repercussions of what you really say. And you just say it and then hope that, you know, you'll get an audience from somewhere. It's very crazy.
In universities, I mean, the faculty, to their own discredit, have been infantilized by the administrators. You know, we have never seen a large-scale incursion of women into large organizations prior to the last 40 years. That's never happened in human history. And we have no idea what the social psychopathology that would be associated with that, as well as the positive benefits. We have no idea what the social psychopathology might be, but the infantilization of everyone and everything might well be it. And so I'm curious about what you think about that. You know, there is data, for example, that women prefer male supervisors. So that's one. You know, it's not overwhelming. It's not overwhelming data, but it's suggestive. And obviously that doesn't mean there are no good female managers.
Do you prefer a male manager or a female manager? Because I know how I feel about it. And we can get into that conversation in a different time.
Talking about broad trends here, but we do potentially have a major societal issue in that men have their pathologies that are expressed socially: aggression, antisocial behavior, drug and alcohol abuse, a tilt towards a kind of self-serving narcissism in some cases, but there's no reason to assume whatsoever that women wouldn't bring their own pathologies to the workplace. And it is the female-dominated institutions that seem to be the most woke. I mean, and that's how the 18 to 34-year-olds vote as well, right? They're radically out of phase with the entire rest of the culture. Mm-hmm. So what do you think about that? And how would you reflect on that, like in your personal experience with the organizations that you've worked with and the managerial situations that you've been in?
It makes perfect sense to me. I accept that as a likely cause of the problem that we're seeing, and probably the more than likely culprit of it. I see exactly what you're saying. And, you know, I guess with today's generation, I ask, it's like a chicken egg. Like these woke institutions are trying to exploit girls' natural empathy, as I said. But those women at some point were the first ones in to a system that hadn't been exploiting their empathy. And they ran wild with it, clearly, because we're now at the place we are. And I see it being done. We just played videotape on the show today from peak BLM, right after George Floyd.
Oh, yeah.
The riots everywhere. And one of those infamous videos where BLM members got up in the face of, it happened to be a woman of color, she looked Latina to me, sitting there trying to eat her lunch at an outdoor cafe. And the BLM crowd was moving in on her, standing over her, screaming in her face, trying to get her fist up to say, Black Lives Matter. And it was all white women. And I remember this from when I lived on the Upper West Side, which included 2020 during the George Floyd-a-palooza.
Wait a minute. Did y'all know about that? Let's look that up real fast. Ain't no way, y'all. Ain't no way. Why are they so all up on her? This one is absolutely insane. As a group of people who are trying to be in support, you were over there harassing a woman who just didn't want to throw up her fist. And that was absolutely insane because, believe me, if it was done by people of color, we wouldn't have been that aggressive on that one woman. It would have been absolutely, we would have moved on. Nobody's out there trying to force nobody to join the movement, for real. It has never been a thing for us. So I don't know what the heck they got going on over there, but surely you need to fix it. Let's jump back into this conversation.
And it was all white women who tended to have some money in their Lululemon out there at these BLM protests. It's like, okay, these women would never want that crowd coming back to their apartment building with them at the end of the day, but they want to be out there on the streets and pretend that they're one of them, that they understand the experience that, you know, your average inner city person of color has had. It's a lie. So I accept, because I've seen women behaving terribly over the past 5 years in particular, and they're at the apex of the bad messaging. And they're the last to come along on the Trump train, which is also disturbing. You know, those same stats I've seen from that you're citing with the young women in particular. They're obsessed with abortion, which I just think speaks to a lot of things, like the absence of religion in the public square. No one's even telling them the other side or the other options. You know, we had laws at one point where you'd have to show women the picture of the fetus before they could abort it. And those got struck down. It was like, no, you can't even show her what she's doing. So I just think the whole system is set up to breed that kind of woman. Like, you'd almost think that it's the kind of woman that society wants because they're so prevalent.
Welcome to this episode of Parenting.
Our 13-year-old throws tantrums quite often, loud screaming tantrums when he doesn't get his way.
There's a time in every child's life when he or she realizes they stand on the precipice of adulthood. It's during this window that learning responsibility becomes crucial.
We're trying to figure out how to get him through this part of his life, become a responsible adult.
If they don't learn how to be autonomous in your household when they're teenagers, how do you expect that they're going to be able to take care of themselves when they leave home? It'd be really good to get this under control. You have to sit down with your husband or wife and you have to see not only where you think things have gone wrong very concretely around specific episodes, but you have to flesh out a vision of what you would rather see instead. You're going to get pushback, but better late than never.
That was good. So we'll get into that.
Well, the question is, did we tilt in that direction with, there's certainly a strain of feminism that developed particularly in the 1960s, although it was there long before that really did in some ways aim at that kind of women. And let me ask you something as well that's deeper. I've studied malevolence as deeply as I can for a very long time, and the philosophical representations of malevolence and the theological representations of malevolence. And the deepest representation is Luciferian. And that trope underlies like the evil scientist in popular entertainment, the idea of the intellect gone mad, the intellect that worships itself, that then usurps and attempts to put itself in the highest place. And so there's an idea that, this is Milton's idea, that, Lucifer, who's the spirit of the unbridled intellect, the light bringer, is the spirit that was most finely made that went most dreadfully wrong. And so the psychological idea there is that there isn't anything more remarkable about human beings than their cognitive ability, but if it becomes master instead of serving something higher, then look the hell out. Now, there's an echo of that that's very, very deep with regards to the maternal instinct. And I think this is what's played out in the Genesis story of the consort between Eve and the serpent. What seems to me to happen is that Eve clutches the poisonous serpent to her breast. And so that's an overextension of that empathy that you described, which is the core element, let's say, of the maternal instinct, and really the instinct that the species itself depends on, right? Human beings have the longest dependency period of any creature by a lot, and human infants are markedly helpless. And so that self-sacrificing compassion that's at the core of the maternal instinct is absolutely vital. But as Freud pointed out, if that goes wrong within families and overextends its domain, so that, for example, that infant-mother bond isn't attenuated as the child develops, then there's nothing that's more devouring than the mother. That's the story of Hansel and Gretel, right? They go out into the forest, chased there in part by the fracturing of their family. And they find a gingerbread house, which is a little bit too good to be true, right? It's not only a house, but it's made out of candy. And so maybe you might suspect that the jig is up when something's painted that beautifully on the outside. I'm oh so compassionate and embracing. And of course, inside there's a witch whose goal is to fatten up the children and to make them helpless so that she can eat them. And so fairy tales are pretty vicious in that sort of representation, but that's also a portrayal of how all devouring the maternal embrace can be if it overextends its domain.
And I think that we do need to think about all of the stuff. Like he said, malevolence, right? It's the perversion of knowledge. And I think he said something very important there, because if you look at all of the switched stories from like the Grimm brothers tales, which are like the Hansel and Gretel, most of the things that we watch, like The Little Mermaid and things like that, come from tales back in the past that had a much deeper and darker meaning, but we have glamified it and glorified it, and then the message that was really underlined has been missed. A lot of these things come out like, oh, she just wanted a man and all that. No, the Disney bullshit has really got you caught up, and I think that he's going to dive deeper into what these stories really meant. And that's why you really need to read and actually look at what the message they were trying to bring to you, because it's not all, oh, if you sacrifice a little bit, you'll get something. Because, man, oh man, Disney stories have everybody effed up. They were nice when you're a kid, but to be honest with you, it's all manipulation, and it's really sick. It's even sick because they have a lot of sexual innuendos in there. So they really turn you out to be a freak. Disney, y'all.
Yeah. Now, it's not like men get off easy in that Genesis story, by the way, when Eve decides she's going to put herself at the center of the moral universe, because that's what she does. She's tempted to become like a god because that's the temptation, and she clutches the serpent to her breast. Adam doesn't object, and he goes along for the ride. And then later in the story, when God wants to walk with Adam so that they're working together, let's say, Adam is hiding behind a bush because he's realized that he's naked. And so the woman and the serpent have made him self-conscious, and now he doesn't have the courage to walk with God. And when God asks him why, he blames the woman, and he blames God for making her. And so I don't want to lay this all at the feet of women, because what I saw in the universities, for example, is that, let's put it this way, that when the maternal instinct went astray, partly because it didn't have any valid target, the men just backed off and didn't oppose it. And so, they're complicit in this disintegration. But we do have a problem on our hands that's not trivial. And we also see this reflected in a growing political divide between young men in particular and young women all across the world, right? Young men are becoming more conservative.
Yeah, I know. It's
young
wonderful.
Young women are becoming more liberal. And they're also not finding each other very effectively. The political, who would have guessed that, so we got two problems. Men and women both have the vote. Now, does that mean they're political enemies? Because that's certainly one of the things that appears to be happening. And then we have the mass migration of women into workforces of a size where empathy cannot be the regulating principle. I'll give you one more example, and then I'll...
So he's about to dive into the workplace and the mentality that it creates. And this is something that Kevin Samuels would dive into very deeply, because the pathos that you have to adapt, or the mindset, because I know a lot of y'all might not know what pathos is, but the mindset you have to adapt does change who you are as a person, because to succeed in the workplace, you do have to take on very masculine traits. And with that being said, that's why a lot of the disparities with wages was a thing of the past. And now we have it where, you pretty much get a singular rate and everybody is placed at the same place. And then the time that you spend within companies most of the time allots you a raise. I don't know if that's a good thing, because at the end of the day, if you're doing more for the company, it doesn't allow you to get the pay that you deserve for your merit, and it doesn't allow for job retention, and that's a problem that we're having as well. But we'll see about all of that. That's a conversation for a different time. Let's get back to it.
If empathy was the appropriate ethos for operation in a corporation, let's say, beyond the size of the family, then the personality trait agreeableness, which is the index of compassion and empathy, would positively predict workplace performance, particularly among managers. But it isn't agreeableness that predicts. It's conscientiousness, which is a cold virtue that typifies conservatives more than liberals. big organizations run on raw cognitive power and conscientiousness. They don't run on empathy. Little bitty families run on empathy, especially when there are infants, but that doesn't scale. And I actually think that's why the personality trait conscientiousness, which is diligence, orderliness, industriousness, is associated often with patriotism and more conservative values. I think that's why it evolved, because empathy does not scale, because everyone isn't a big, happy family. And once you exceed kin group size in your organization, you have to turn to a different ethos. And that, I think that's particularly problematic for unconscientious women who self-aggrandize on the basis of their compassion.
Yeah, there's a lot in there, and I agree with a lot of it. I keep thinking about the fact that, look, I'm a Gen Xer, and I was raised by a boomer, right, who was part of that first wave of feminism, who, they were told you can have it all at the same time, and you're kind of a failure if you don't have it all at the same time. And that generation of mothers did as told and left their kids alone for a large portion of their childhoods. And that wasn't a bad thing. And I have a great relationship with my mom. I'm not saying I'm glad she wasn't around that much, but it led to self-sufficiency and independence and absolutely no overbearing motherhood. That wasn't a thing in the 1970s or the 1980s. We were so neglected. We were called latchkey kids, where you had a key around your neck to let yourself back in after you walked home from school. And you didn't really know when your parents were going to come home. There were rules like, be home when it gets dark. Your parents had no idea where you were and really didn't care. Those were good things. Those were, building the ties for appropriate separation at the earliest possible age. Love always remains, caring and all that stays, but not overbearing motherhood or fatherhood for that matter. And that generation, so that's me now, and maybe my brother and sister, who are older. And I think we'll raise the solution to the problem that came just a little bit after we came. Because I think what started to happen was those women got into the workforce and they were doing it all, and they would commit to work because there was an understanding that they would not blow it for the next generation of women. They'd been given the keys to the kingdom. Now you come in and you do well at these jobs, and you don't talk about your kids, and you don't leave to go home early, and you don't insist on flexible work schedules. So the women did it, and they raised tough Gen X kids who were fine. But as they started to get more rights at the office, and it sounds great on paper, okay, flex time, and I only have to work part-time, and I have to leave early for this thing and the other thing and so on. And the workplace started to bend more to supporting what mothers needed in their motherly roles. The mothers were home more, and I think started to overcorrect, started to see like go from the latchkey kid to the, the helicopter parent, right? Where I'm never leaving you alone. I'm gonna somehow overcompensate and be the parent that I didn't have, or that the generation before me didn't have. And slowly we started to migrate to parents who never leave their children alone, mothers and fathers for that matter, but especially mothers. And that leads to helplessness. And it leads to leaning into victimization and finding the newest disorder and overplaying any injury, because you can get attention that way, especially when you have a mother whose competition you can potentially beat by overacting your injury or your upset, etc. Like if you're in competition with a job and she's got to go to the job and you know that, you don't do anything as the child. You understand that's the deal. But if there's a split between her attentions and you've got to play for it, I think you lean into more upset, more victimhood, more things that would get a mother's attention naturally. Like, I have a disorder. I'm not well. I need extra help.
Yeah, well, that'll get her attention if she doesn't have anything better to do. And it has no sense, right? But that is another example of that exaggeration of compassion to the point that it becomes toxic. And the fact that it's necessary to human beings, especially in the early years, like vital, also means that it's a very difficult force to regulate. I mean, the general rule for caretaking, and this goes for the elderly as well, pretty much anybody you're actually taking care of, is don't do anything for anyone that they can do for themselves.
And what do you think? And excuse me, guys, I'm not feeling too well, but I got to get you guys this good content. So if you can, hit that like button for me. Hit the subscribe if you're new here. It's absolutely free to you and it helps us to grow. And I greatly appreciate everybody that helps me out.